Well, hello everyone. My name is Devin Knight again, and welcome to another video, and frankly, another new series on Power Automate. And in this short series, we're going to be exploring using the Graph API inside of Power Automate. Now, for those of you not very familiar with the Graph API, Microsoft Graph API, will give you the ability to tap into some of the very common objects inside of Microsoft that you might want to pull information out of or send information into. For example, it'll allow you to tap into things like Azure Active Directory. You'll be able to tap into things like Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, Word Online, anything that's connected into Office 365 or Microsoft 365 products has many different capabilities built into the Graph API. Now, why would you want to use that inside of Power Automate, you might be asking? And that's because some of the connectors that are built in to things like Microsoft Teams may not have the full function capability that you might want to be able to solve some particular task. So, for example, in the use case that we're going to be doing over the course of these next few videos, we're going to be connecting into the Graph API through Power Automate so that we can add in guest users. That'll be the first thing we're going to do, is add in a guest user, meaning a user that's not part of my tenant already. We're going to add them into our tenant as a guest user, and then we're going to take those guest users and add them to a private Teams channel. That is a challenge that you can't do with the Teams connectors that are available to you right now. You cannot very easily connect them and add them to a private Teams channel. And so that's what we're going to learn about in this video series that we're starting today. Now, if you are new to our channel, make sure you don't forget to go ahead and subscribe, like this video if you want to see more of these, and hit that notification bell too to make sure you know whenever we post new videos on a regular basis. You want to make sure you're notified of that. So hit that bell and you'll be notified whenever they occur. All right, so this, like I mentioned, is going to be a video series because there are many steps that go into this process. Today's first step is going to be focused in on creating some of the collateral or the objects that need to be created inside of your Azure portal. You actually do need to create an Azure application inside of your Active Directory to be able to manage the permissions and how it's going to connect into meaning Graph API, is going to connect into applications like Power Automate. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen here for a moment and show you inside of Power Automate how you can hit a roadblock rather quickly if you do not set up the components in Azure that are required. So I'm going to show you the roadblock that you'll catch and then show you how to get around that roadblock. That's really the first point, or the point of today's first video. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new flow. This is just going to be a very simple instant cloud flow. We will name this our YouTube Graph API example. And we're going to be using a manual trigger for this example, so we'll go ahead and select that and then hit create. I do also want to add in a parameter into our trigger, so I'm going to go ahead and add in an input, and it's going to be a text input with my email address. So my goal of what we're going to try and do is we're going to pretend as though someone has filled out a form, and whenever they fill out that form, maybe a registration form, when they fill that form out, it should add them in as a guest user into our Azure Active Directory, and that is something that Graph API can help us do. We're then going to use that same email address to then go put them into a Microsoft team and then a Microsoft Teams channel. So we have a lot of things that we're going to do over the course of this series, but let's start off with a very basic flow with a manual trigger with an email input. All right, once we have that, we're then going to add in a new step. So I'm going to hit new step here. And that new step is going to be using an HTTP action. And you'll notice I do want to highlight here that the HTTP action is a premium action, meaning you do need to have premium Power Automate licensing to be able to use this particular action. Now, I'm not going to get super deep into licensing in this video. That's not the point of today's video. But do your research. Make sure you may already have premium licensing. But if you don't, you want to make sure that you are prepared for that whenever you're going through an example like this if you're following along. All right, so we're going to use the HTTP connector, and inside of this connector, you'll see pretty early on that you're going to hit some roadblocks. One is you're going to select what kind of method it is that you want to use. Now, you can notice that the HTTP connector can be used for things far different than the Graph API. You don't have to only use Graph API for this particular action. but the Graph API can be used here, and you have the ability with really any API to pull in for information using a GET, to be able to push information into the connector using the POST, and there's many other types of things you can do here as well. For our example, or very simple example, we're going to do a GET. And what we're going to eventually go through the process of doing as we go through this example is we're going to get some information about the email address that our user plugs in. So whenever a user plugs in an email address, I want to return back information about that particular email. Meaning, for example, if they are already inside of our Azure Active Directory, I want to return back the GUID or the ID that's associated with that email user. All right, we're going to come back here because the piece that we're missing right now that's really going to be a roadblock and preventing us from going any further is inside the Show Advanced Options. You're going to have to specify how are you going to authenticate, and we're going to be authenticating using the Azure Active Directory OAuth. And when we select that, you'll notice that there are several different options down here below, like our tenant, the client ID, a secret here that we're going to have to pass in. All of those are things that we won't have available to us until we do a few steps with inside of the Azure portal. And that's really what the point of this video is doing that initial setup and configuring things so that way you're prepared to use the Graph API here inside of Power Automate. All right, so that's where we are now. We need to take a step into the Azure portal to be able to bind the Graph API to an Azure application within inside of Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to open up a new tab within inside of my web browser here, and we're going to go to portal.azure.com. And if you're not already signed in, you will be prompted to sign in. In my case, I am already signed in, so we're good to go here. And we're going to be going in to manage our Azure Active Directory. Now, if you don't see Active Directory up at the very top here, like I do, you can always search for it up on the top here and search for Azure Active Directory, and you should be able to find it up in your search when you're searching for services. So I'm going to go ahead and select Azure Active Directory. And then once I do that, we are going to add in a new app registration over here on the left-hand side. So we're registering an app to be able to be managed within inside of our Azure Active Directory. That way we can siphon through our permissions using Active Directory here as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and select app registration. And we're going to create a new registration up here on the top. So I'm going to select new registration. I'll go ahead and do that. And then we're going to name the app here that's going to be displayed. So we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to go ahead and call mine YouTube Graph API Example. Now, there are different levels of permission that you can set up for any one of these apps that you create, whether or not you want to have only people within your tenant have access to them, whether or not you want to have people outside of your tenant have access to them, or whether or not you even want to have those that maybe aren't using a business account. Maybe they're using just a regular Xbox account or a Skype account. You can still have those users be able to connect into your application if you were to use one of these final two options here. Now, for the purposes of our solution, I only want people that are part of my work organization to be able to have access to this API, this Graph API connection. So we're going to leave the top option selected and then hit register. All right, once we create and register the API connection here, we're then going to need to set up API permissions. The API permissions can be found on the left-hand side. This is where we're going to specify what kind of access we are going to have within the Graph API. So I'm going to go ahead and select the app permissions. And now this is where you may have a little bit of roadblock, because how do you know what level of permissions you want to grant access into the Graph API? You have to determine what makes sense for what you're trying to do. So this is where you may do a little bit of research into the Graph API to determine what are the things you're trying to do and then what permissions are required for those things you're trying to do. So I have the documentation for the couple actions that we're trying to do. We want to get users, so get some information about our users. We want to also invite users. Eventually, we'll do this later in a later video. So meaning that if a user does not already exist within inside of our system, we want to invite them. We then want to also be able to add members to a Teams channel. So each of these documentation, the documentation within inside the Microsoft Docs, which I'll put links to these within inside of our video description. But each of these, when you go to explore every one of the documentation here, you'll notice that there's a section here for permissions. And the permission section tells you exactly what level of permissions that you need to provide for the API to be able to connect. And there's different levels here that you can set up, whether or not you want to set up permissions at the application level or delegated through an account. You can kind of determine that here whenever you're looking at the permission section. But what we need to do is we need to look at the table that's provided to determine what type of app permissions are needed. So if, for example, I'm doing this at the application level, I would need to provide one of these levels of permission, noticing here that it says that the least level of permissions is on the left to the most level of permissions on the right. So you can determine here which route you want to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each of these tables, the permission section, and I'm going to look at the application section, and I'm going to do a little bit extra permissions than maybe I really need to, but I'm going to look here and I'm going to say, hey, I need to apply the directory, read, write, all. I need to go over to the create the invitation one, and I can see directory, read, write, all will also help us there. So it's the same level of permissions for this API call. And then the final one here is the channel member read, write, all. So those two different things we want to set up, channel member read, write, all and directory read, write, all, are going to give our app the permissions that are needed. All right, so to do this, we now have the documentation. Again, I'll put this in the video description for you so you can read more on these. We're now going to apply our app permissions by selecting Add a Permission up here on the top. Now, when we select Add a Permission, on the right-hand side, you can select, of course, that we are working with the Graph API. So we're going to choose the Graph API as the API that we're trying to use for this example. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then we're going to choose on the right-hand side the application permissions, but of course I recommend you reading up on these and determining what's the best fit for your use case. We're going to select the app permissions for our use case, and then we saw in the documentation the two level of permissions that we need to turn on. One of them was the directory, which you can search for here and find the directory permissions. And we're going to go ahead and turn on directory.read, write, read, write, all, this one right here. So that's one of the levels of permissions we're going to turn on. And then the other one, if you remember, we can go flip back to our documentation again, but the other one that we had was called channel member. So channel member, and you can find that category right here. And we're going to turn on channel member.readwrite.all here as well. So by turning on those two levels of permissions, we'll hit add permissions on the bottom. You can see those two new levels of permissions have been added within inside of our app permission section. And then we need to make sure that we grant the permissions here at the tenant level, at the Contoso level. So I'm going to go ahead and hit grant admin consent. And then we'll hit yes here. Now when we do that, that's now going to have and provide the permissions that are required to this API. So that way, whenever we attempt to call it from within inside of Power Automate, it has all the permissions that are needed for this example. It should not struggle with connecting to and using this in any way as it works its way through our flows. So that's one of the things we're going to take a peek at here next. All right, that's our documentation. I can get rid of that here for now. And we're going to work our way back over to Power Automate now. Now, we are not done on the Azure portal side. We actually need to still create a certificate and I should say a secret. But let's come back to that after we explore and find the point where we're going to need that within inside of Power Automate. So I'm going to flip back over to Power Automate here for a few moments. And within inside of Power Automate, we are going to make a call to the Graph API using the HTTP connector here to pull back information on the email address that's provided whenever this flow runs. So you can find out what the URI, you'll find that property right here, is by looking at some of that same documentation I was showing earlier. So let me bring that back over here again. If I wanted to get information about a user, I can use the API call that's found right here. So it's helping me, giving me some guidance on how I can actually use this to bring back information about a particular user. So what I'd like to do is I want to pass in an email address and then get back the user ID, like the GUID that's hidden behind the scenes for me within inside of Azure Active Directory. So I happen to have a little query that I already have sectioned out here where I'm going to bring back the user, and I'm also going to pass in my email address that I want to capture so that way I can bring back who it is that I'm trying to get back information for. All right, so let me go ahead and paste in this part of the URL. We do have a little bit of a search here. So we're using the user's call into the Graph API. We're passing in a filter that we want to return back information based on an email address we provide. And then inside of the single quotes that you see right here, we're going to pass in the email from our trigger. Ooh, I lost it. Let me try that again. So from inside of our URL, we're going to scroll down to the dynamic content, and we're going to capture the email address that's plugged in whenever we manually run the flow. So let me go ahead and select email right here. Let me take myself off screen for a moment so you can actually see that. So we're going to use the email dynamic content, plug that into our URL, like so. And then that way we'll be able to bring back information based on whatever email address is plugged into the manual trigger, or maybe it's from a form, or maybe it's from a SharePoint list, whatever it is. We're passing in the email, and we're going to return back information from the Graph API. The other things that we need to do is we do need to pass in the header information. This is going to always be the same regardless of the connector you're using. It's going to be content-type. And then for the value, you're going to use the application/JSON, because this is JSON that we're looking at here. It does really a lot of Power Automate leverages and uses JSON throughout. All right, so then we're going to scroll down a little bit lower. If you hadn't already, we switched the authentication to Azure Active Directory OAuth. We did that. I did that on my video here early on, but if you haven't already done that, you'll do that now. And then what we need to do is we need to start to pass in some of the required fields here. We're required to pass in a tenant, an audience, a client ID, the credential type. We're going to keep that a secret, and then we need to pass in the secret value here as well. All right, so we got a lot of things that we're going to do. So we're going to start by passing in the tenant ID. Where do you find the tenant ID? That's going to be back in Azure. So I'm going to go flip back over to Azure, and I'm going to select the API application here that we're working with, and you'll find the tenant ID up here on the top. Now, normally I would not want to share that on my screen, the directory or the tenant ID. However, I am using a demo tenant that's going to be trashed before this video is even posted, so not really anything you can do with this. So I no harm in me sharing this. So I'm going to grab the tenant ID and hit the little copy button to my clipboard, bring that back over to Power Automate, and paste in the tenant ID right here. Good, perfect. The next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to go grab the client ID, and I can find the client ID on the exact same screen. If I go back over to the Azure portal again, you can find the client ID up on the top, found right here. It's called application or client ID. So we're going to go ahead and copy the client ID and then bring that back over to Power Automate and paste that in where it says client ID. All right, looking pretty good. Now you'll notice I skipped audience. We'll go ahead and capture audience. Audience is really the URL here. We're going to pass in the Graph API URL, so graph.microsoft.com. So you'll paste that in. That'll clear up the audience. And then the final section here that we need is a secret. Now this has to do with, you'll probably have maybe experienced the idea of the secret code for authentication with other applications that maybe you've worked with, but this is pretty common when it comes to working with APIs. And so what we're going to do in this case is we're going to go capture the secret from inside of the Azure portal again by going back over to Azure, and then we're going to go find on the left-hand side of our screen. Over on the left-hand side, you'll find there's a section here called Certificates and Secrets, and that's where we're going to go to be able to create this new secret ID or secret value that we need inside of Power Automate. This is how you're able to authenticate and pass through credentials into Power Automate. So I'm going to go ahead and select Certificates and Secrets, and we're going to create a new client secret, and then we'll give it a description. So I can call this just something like our YouTube example. And then you do have to set an expiry, so you have to set when you want this to expire, whether it be 24 months or 3 months or whatever. I'm going to go ahead and do 24 months and then hit add. So this is going to create a new secret here for us, and you can see that right here is the object that we just created. Now, what can be a little confusing is that you may think that you want the secret ID. However, you don't want the secret ID. You actually want the value right here. That's what you're going to bring into Power Automate to be able to finalize the authentication to the API. So I'm going to go ahead and select the copy to clipboard on the value, not the ID. I'm going to copy that and go bring that over to Power Automate again, and we're going to paste that in where it says secret right there. All right, so we're looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And this is a very basic Power Automate solution. All it's going to return back really for us here is just the ID for the email address that we pass in. So nothing too fancy for this example. We're going to explore some more complex things we can do in future videos. But for the purposes of this one, again, this one's being pretty basic, we're going to go ahead and test what we have here right now. So I'm going to go up to the top right and hit save. I could have gone into the test section as well. So we're going to go ahead and hit test and manually test this and run the test. Remember, we did have a parameter in our trigger, so we need to pass in that value. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in my email address that I'm using for this demo tenant that we're using. And then, again, I'll take myself off screen so you can see what I'm pressing here. But then we'll go ahead and press the run flow. It will execute our flow, and we should hopefully see a successful run, and we do. It was very quick. And if we expand the HTTP trigger, which we should have named a little bit better, it's not a trigger actually, it's an action, we can see what happened behind the scenes. So what we can see is if you look at the body or the output below, is it brought back the ID value for the email address that we passed in. That is the GUID that is stored within inside of Azure Active Directory for the email address that we sent in. This is just a starting point of what you can do with the Graph API. We're going to explore in some future videos other things that we can explore and do. We're also going to explore the Graph Explorer briefly, just to show you the different areas of the Graph Explorer that will allow you to see what kind of things are available within the Graph API. But this is just a little peek in this video at what's possible. We saw that we can set up the application within inside of Azure Active Directory, we set the permissions, and we came back to Power Automate to actually use those permissions within inside of the flow design. So this is just a starting point. Hopefully this gets you in a good position to get moving forward with using the Graph API. Hope you liked this first video. If you did, hit that like button. Make sure you let others know and let me know that you want more videos like this. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that way you will see when these videos come, and hit that notification bell, more importantly almost, to be notified whenever we have new videos that are dropped. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much, and look forward to showing you more about working with the Graph API within inside of Power Automate in our future videos. Thank you so much.